Hey, what is up guys, MurganMan4 here, and today I'm going to be continuing my series of classic Doctor Who reviews with Season 19. The introduction of Peter Davison, the return of the Cybermen, and the death of a much maligned companion. Airing in 1982, Season 19 was John Nathan Turner's second season in the producer chair. And now with Tom Baker gone, he could finally take full control of the series and take it in whatever direction he wanted it to go. This season introduced us to Peter Davison's fifth Doctor, a much softer and far less alien incarnation than Tom Baker's had been. It also featured a full TARDIS crew of 4 for the majority of the season, something that hadn't been attempted since the 1960s 2 decades earlier, and wouldn't be attempted again until Chris Chibnall took over the show about 3 decades later. In my opinion, this season's a bit of a bumpy ride, so why don't we just dive in and we'll see what went wrong and what went right. Castrovalva is the third in a trilogy of stories, following The Keeper of Traken and Logopolis, that details the return of the Master after a long break from the show. Perhaps an unpopular opinion, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm not really a huge fan of this trilogy. I find it to be relatively weak, and Castrovalva is the bottom of the bunch for me. That's not to say it's bad, but it just generally fails to impress. We spend the first episode and a half or so in the TARDIS with the newly regenerated Doctor trying to deal with his worst case of post-regeneration trauma yet, and it's this portion of the story that I find the most interesting. I love seeing the Doctor trying to deal with his uncertainty and his dementia, and it's also a lot of fun to explore different parts of the TARDIS. We see lots of TARDIS corridors, but we're also introduced to the Zero Room in this story, which helps stabilize Time Lords after regeneration. However, by the end of the second episode, we're introduced to Castrovalva, the serial's namesake, and I don't know, I just find this location pretty well drab and uninteresting. There's a neat idea behind it, that it's actually just a trap used to lure the Doctor, but I just don't really feel enough is done with it to make it that exciting or entertaining. It's just a shame that this portion of the story couldn't be more engaging, especially since it takes up over half of it. And although Peter Davison is rather charming in this first appearance, all the companions, they just don't really make much of an impression, which is something that's pretty common throughout this season, actually. It could certainly be worse, but for me, Castrovalva barely escapes mediocre and sits around a 5.5 out of 10. Fort of Doomsday has an interesting shell of an idea. This being that sees himself as a god, and after multiple trips to Earth, in an effort to learn about the planet, he finally returns for one final visitation to enact the end of the world. Despite some nice set design, the spaceship interiors generally look quite impressive, and some charming moments from Davison, such as when he craftily disables one of Monarch's Monopticons, Fort of Doomsday just generally misses the mark. Not by that much, but by enough. The villains of the piece, led by Monarch, are quite frankly pretty laughable and often appear quite dense, certainly never amounting to any sort of a threat. The plot threads just don't feel like they mesh together coherently, and the ending seems quite rushed, with Monarch being disposed of in quite literally just a few seconds, and the TARDIS team immediately leaving, and then that's it. It's not exactly a bad story overall, but it's certainly got more bad than good in it, so perhaps quite fittingly, I'm going to be giving Fort of Doomsday a 4 out of 10. Wow. Just wow. Up to this point, Season 19 has been just a tad underwhelming. But here, seemingly out of nowhere, we're given an honest-to-God classic and one of my favorite stories of all time. While it falters ever so slightly in the second half, the first 2 parts of this story are honestly masterpieces. And that does not come from me lightly. You'll notice I do not use that term very often. I genuinely don't know where to begin because there's so much good stuff. Pretty much every aspect of the story is amazing. Every single guest character is extremely memorable and excellently performed. Of particular note for me is Simon Rouse, who puts in a genuinely disturbing performance as the deranged Hindle, gradually descending into madness, and for me is honestly one of the strongest guest characters and performances in the show's entire history. The story as well is totally engrossing. You have all these different story elements, such as the Kinda tribe, or the colonist scout team, and the Mara's gradual invasion, that all tie together effortlessly and keeps you curious about how these threads are going to come together and affect the story next. It's also a rare example of a story where every single cliffhanger is on top form. You absolutely must know what's happening next, and even if you already know what's coming, it keeps you on the edge of the seat every single time. I mentioned earlier that I think the first half is ever so slightly better than the second half. And I think that's pretty much down to the disturbing dream sequences that the Mara induces in Tegan. It's probably some of the most disturbing stuff ever produced for the show. It encapsulates madness and pure psychological terror in a way that's never achieved to the same level of effectiveness again. This is a very different kind of story, and it really, really benefits from it. Fantastic in pretty well every form, and very much deserving of its 9.5 out of 10. Eric Sayward's first contribution in the scriptwriting chair isn't really anything all that special, although it does have a few notable elements to it. There are parts which feel particularly modern, such as the opening scenes of the story, which really feel like they could work just as well in the modern day as a new series pre-credits sequence. This story also introduces us to the Pteroleptals, an easily recognizable race within the Doctor Who fandom, despite only appearing in this story and having a cameo in Time Flight. Although I have to say I can't quite understand why this race is so iconic and recognizable. While the Pteroleptal leader does prove to be a strong threat, and the role is played with relish by Michael Melia, who does an excellent job, I just don't really see anything particularly special about the race as a whole. Of course, the story is also the last in the classic era to feature the Doctor's trusty sonic screwdriver, departing with a simple but rather fitting parting line from the Doctor.
I feel as though you've just killed an old friend.
I do quite enjoy the concept of the Pteroleptals taking advantage of the Black Plague as a way to take over the planet. And I also can't fail to mention Michael Robin's immensely enjoyable performance as the actor-turned-highwayman Richard Mace. The Visitation may not be particularly special, but I think it's got some good ideas in it, and it is a fair amount of fun, so I'll give it a respectable 7.5 out of 10. Black Orchid is a very odd story. Not only is it the first two-part story since 1975's The Sontaran Experiment, 7 years earlier, but it also technically fits into the pure historical category, essentially defined by a story that doesn't feature any science fiction elements outside of the Doctor, his companions, and the TARDIS. For the very first time since 1967's The Highlanders, 15 years earlier. It would also be the last story of the show to be considered under this category. It's also really, really slow. Slow enough that it is time for a good 3 minutes of just plain cricket, with nothing at all to advance the plot, just straight up cricket. It's a two-part story and they can't even fill it all out. This does make it a tad boring at times, despite only being 2 parts. Once they finally get to the Cranleigh house and the party begins, and the plot actually starts moving forward, things do start to get a bit more interesting. You've got a murderer on the loose, and of course, Nissa's lookalike Anne, which makes for a fun little twist, even if ultimately they don't really do much with it. The period setting is also a decent amount of fun. Honestly, it's not all that bad. It's entertaining enough, I guess. It just doesn't even have enough content to fully fill just 2 episodes, so I can't really give it anything more than a 6 out of 10. Eric Sayward was clearly just warming up with the Visitation, because Earthshock is not even in the same ballpark. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Kinda earlier this season and Earthshock were both directed by the same director, Peter Grimwade. It's rather ironic that a season that I consider rather meh, pretty much all around, contains 2 of my all-time favorite stories. Like Kinda, Earthshock is fantastic in pretty much every single respect. This story also features a couple of major surprises. The return of the Cybermen, for the first time since 1975's Revenge of the Cybermen, now in all their 1980s glory, and the death of Adric, the first companion since Katarina in 1965, whose journey ends in death. I absolutely adore the redesigned Cybermen. It's honestly my all-time favorite Cyberman look. And David Banks is just fantastic as the Cyber Leader. I don't care in the slightest that these Cybermen perhaps show a little bit too much emotion. Banks' delivery is menacing and gripping, and I honestly couldn't think of a more excellent Cyber Leader. As for the other surprise, despite being such a despised character, and I'm really not that different, Adric is one of my least favorite companions too, his death is superbly done. He gets a great final line, and there's an incredibly emotional closing scene that genuinely leads to one of the most powerful moments in the show's entire history. Earthshock also features one of my favorite scores. The Cybermen theme is utterly haunting and chilling. And just like Kinda, every single cliffhanger is a cracker. You just can't wait to find out what happens next. This story is dark and scary. It's intense, and the threat feels incredibly real. And each episode builds one after the other to an incredible climax, and I have nothing but praise for this story. So it receives a rather excellent 9.5 out of 10. Peter Grimwood, you're a superb director. I just really wish I could say the same about your writing. Oh, I don't understand what happened to make Time Flight the absolute mess that it is. And I hate to say it, but it is perhaps one of, if not the most unwatchable Who stories ever brought to the screen. Especially in older productions, poor effects tend to not bother me too much, but here it's just painful how poorly realized everything is. From the Jurassic setting to the plasmatons, which look like giant walking turds. The story makes no sense whatsoever, and it has to have one of the most shocking reveals of all time when it's revealed that Khalid is actually the Master, and not because it's at all well executed, but because, like the rest of the story, it makes absolutely no sense. The Master has no reason to be disguised at all, and it's especially mind-boggling when you realize that probably 90% of the time that he's in the disguise, there's no one to be disguised from. He's all alone. I honestly don't believe there's any Doctor Who story without at least some sort of value to it. And at least with Time Flight, there's some sort of semi-interesting premise, that of a plane that gets caught in a time contour and sent back to the Jurassic era. And the cast genuinely do try their best, but the story basically fails in every single regard, and I'm sorry to say, it's well deserving of a 1.5 out of 10. What a way to end the season. As you can probably gather from my scores, Season 19 is a bit of an odd one for me. This season is mostly made up of stories that I think are fine. I don't mind them, but I'm never really going to choose to watch them. I'm not going to seek them out. And then, amidst those episodes, you somehow have one of my least favorite stories of all time, and two of my favorite stories of all time. I don't know how such an inconsistency in story quality arose, but it is mind-boggling. As for the main cast, I think they're all really strong actors, except for Matthew Waterhouse. Sorry, Matthew. But you'll notice that I barely mentioned any of them throughout my story reviews, and that's because there's barely anything interesting about the characters, or good as they can be. Their performances often don't stand out, to be honest. Not only do we have an overcrowded TARDIS team, but also perhaps one of the most forgettable ones. But despite Kinda and Earthshock, two incredibly strong entries for the show, the rest of the season just simply doesn't do enough. And Season 19 is perhaps one of the most bland and uninteresting seasons in my mind. Well, now that we've gone through all that, it'll be really interesting to see how the statistics of the season stack up, and how does it compare to the previously reviewed Season 12. This season has an incredibly wide range of stories, starting at the top with Earthshock and Kinda, followed by the Visitation, Black Orchid, Castrovalva, Fort of Doomsday, and finally, in dead last, Time Flight. Even two of the best stories in the show's history can't keep Season 19's average score above a 6.2 out of 10. And now for the interesting bit, where we get to see where Season 19 stands with the other seasons. Well, at the moment, just Season 12. But of course, when it comes to comparing seasons, decades, and Doctor's eras, For the moment, Peter Davison's debut is a full point behind. In terms of writers, Christopher Bailey now takes the top spot with an average of 9.5 out of 10, followed by Eric Sayward in 4th with an 8.5 out of 10, Christopher H. Bidmead in 7th with a 5.5 out of 10, Terrence Dudley in 8th with a 5 out of 10, and Peter Grimwade at the bottom with a 1.5 out of 10. We also have a new producer to add to our list in John Nathan Turner, whose average is sitting at 6.2 out of 10. I also realized that last time I accidentally left out two very important positions, that of script editor, who's often overlooked but has a ton of impact on the finished product of an episode, and in some cases honestly deserves the credit much more than the credited writer, and that of the director, who of course brings the written words to the screen. So starting now, I'll also be including both director and script editor categories here. So for script editors, the current standing is Robert Holmes at the top with 7.2 out of 10, followed by Eric Sayward with 6.4 out of 10, and finally Anthony Root with 5.8 out of 10. And for directors, we have Peter Grimwade at the top with 9.5 out of 10, followed by David Maloney with 9 out of 10, Rodney Bennett with 8 out of 10, Peter Moffat and Christopher Barry both with 7.5 out of 10, Fiona Cumming with 5.5 out of 10, John Black with 4 out of 10, Ron Jones with 3.8 out of 10, and lastly, Michael E. Bryant with 3.5 out of 10. Finally, when it comes to event episodes, Season 19 takes the bottom for all three categories that it's eligible for. Castrovalva is sitting 2 points below Robot in both the premiere and Doctor debut categories, giving them both an average of 6.5 out of 10, while Time Flight is sitting 2 points below Revenge of the Cybermen in the finale category, giving it an average of 2.5 out of 10. There really is nowhere else to go but up for the finales. But that's it. My thoughts on Doctor Who Season 19. Please leave your thoughts on Season 19 down in the comments below. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed. And with that, Murderman 4, over and out. And I'll see you guys later.